Let me ask you something. What happens when a nation, drunk on its own superiority, begins to believe it's invincible? What happens when the arrogance of power becomes so absolute that it forgets how the real world works? Let me tell you, a history sharpens its knife. That night when Iran struck, it wasn't just missiles that cracked through Israeli defenses. It was the shattering of a myth of untouchable power, a myth of eternal dominance. The world watched in stunned silence as the carefully constructed image of invincibility began to tremble. And let's be honest, it needed to, because pride, when it festers into arrogance, becomes blind, and blindness in power. That's the recipe for collapse. There is a hard truth most nations refuse to swallow. Asterisk asterisk, you are only as powerful as your awareness of your limitations. Asterisk asterisk. Israel, for too long, carried itself as the immovable object in a region built on shifting sands. Bolstered by foreign backing, endless funding, unwavering media support, it crafted an illusion of total control. But illusions have a funny way of disappearing when they're challenged by something real, something raw, something desperate. And that's what Iran delivered, not just an attack, but a defiant reminder. Asterisk asterisk, you are not above consequence. Asterisk asterisk, we've reached a time in history where people have forgotten how fast power can change hands. One moment you're hailed as the protector of peace, the next you're exposed as the architect of provocation. In that single, calculated retaliation, Iran did what no press conference or propaganda machine could undo. It dented the pride of a nation that thought it could act without pushback. It sent a message that roared louder than any diplomatic statement. Asterisk, you are not God. Asterisk, this isn't about picking sides. This is about asterisk asterisk, understanding the cost of unchecked pride. Asterisk asterisk, Israel was warned again and again that its path was one paved with provocation, with escalation, with disregard. But when a nation starts to believe it's exempt from the rules of decency, humility, or diplomacy, then retaliation becomes inevitable. It's not justification, it's basic logic, and when that logic arrives at your doorstep at 2 a.m., in the form of incoming fire, it's no longer theory. It's reality. You see, when we study conflict, we often obsess over statistics, how many missiles were fired, how many were intercepted. But numbers don't capture the soul of a moment. What happened that night wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. A wall cracked, a curtain dropped, and beneath it, the world saw the raw truth. Asterisk asterisk, pride doesn't protect you, it isolates you. Asterisk asterisk, the tragedy isn't just in the missiles. The tragedy is in how preventable this was, in how many warnings were ignored, in how deaf power becomes when it believes it has the moral high ground. But pride has a price, and for Israel that night the bill finally arrived, and if you're watching this thinking it doesn't affect you, think again. Because pride, unchecked, exists in all of us, in nations, in leaders, in you, in me. And unless we learn to recognize the moment when confidence crosses into arrogance, we are destined to fall just as they did that night under a sky that no longer belonged to them. Where were you when the world chose silence? Because that's what this really comes down to, not the missiles. Not the politics, not the long, complicated history. No, the defining image of that night wasn't the fire in the sky, but the deafening quiet that followed it. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from cowardice. The kind that echoes louder than any explosion ever could. Let's not kid ourselves, the world saw what happened. Every leader, every media outlet, every so-called defender of justice witnessed a nation's pride being shaken. Yet instead of outrage, there was hesitation. Instead of accountability, there was discomfort. And instead of voices raised for truth, there was a chilling, deliberate silence. Why? Because speaking up requires spine, and in this era of calculated diplomacy and selective outrage, spine is in short supply. Silence, my friends, is no longer neutral. not in a world this connected, this informed, this exposed. When you choose not to speak in the face of blatant retaliation, whether justified or not, you're not abstaining. You're participating, you're complicit. There's no middle ground when the stakes are this high. When human lives are leveraged as political currency, neutrality is a betrayal of conscience. This wasn't just a moment of geopolitical reckoning, it was a moral test, and let's be brutally honest, the world failed it. Nations that pride themselves on moral clarity faltered. Commentators who preach about courage suddenly found their scripts rewritten. Media outlets tiptoed, terrified of breaking from the narrative that's been spoon-fed to the masses for years, because truth, a real, uncomfortable truth, doesn't fit neatly into a press release. You see, speaking out isn't hard when it's safe. It's easy to condemn violence when it suits your agenda, but when the tables turn, when the power dynamics shift, when those you've vilified rise up suddenly, everyone loses their voice. That silence, that wasn't diplomacy, that was fear dressed up as strategy, it was self-interest masquerading as wisdom. What we saw that night was a mirror, a reflection of who we are as a global society. We claim to care about justice, about human rights, about peace, but only when it's convenient. Only when it doesn't rattle our alliances or threaten our economic interests. The silence didn't protect peace, it exposed hypocrisy. But here's the real tragedy. This silence sends a message. It tells the oppressed to sit down. It tells the grieving their pain doesn't matter. And it tells the aggressors that they can act without consequence, because the world will simply look away. And if we accept that, if we allow silence to become the norm, we are surrendering the last thread of our shared humanity. So ask yourself, where were you when the world stayed silent? More importantly, where will you stand the next time the silence begins to fall? Because whether you whisper or roar, the world is listening, and history, I assure you, will remember who had the courage to speak and who chose the comfort of silence. Everyone wants to talk about war like it's a numbers game. Who has the most jets, the best technology, the sharpest intelligence? But let me tell you something most politicians and analysts will never admit. Real strength doesn't come from weapons. It comes from resolve. And that night, the world didn't just witness a military act. It witnessed the raw, unmistakable force of national resolve rising from the ashes. We're living in a world where the perception of power has been reduced to showmanship. Nations flex with media campaigns and military parades. They speak in threats backed by billion-dollar arsenals and smug assurances of superiority. But Iran didn't lean on spectacle. It didn't need to. What it displayed that night was a kind of power far more intimidating, the power of a people who have suffered, endured, been demonized, and yet refused to break. You can destroy buildings. You can sabotage infrastructure. You can isolate and sanction until your spreadsheets are blue in the face. But what you can't break, what you will never control, is a people's will to survive on their own terms. That's what makes resolve so dangerous to empires. It can't be bought, it can't be bullied, and it certainly can't be bombed into submission. That night wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. No one celebrates death. No one applauds loss. But for a nation that's been painted into the corner of world opinion for decades, it was something else entirely. It was clarity. It was the moment they said, "We are not here to please, we are here to persist." That's not aggression. That's survival. That's resolve. And let's be honest, the West wasn't prepared for that kind of defiance. They expected a desperate act. What they got was a deliberate stand, and it rattled the narrative. Because deep down, we all understand one thing: when a people stop asking for permission to exist, they become unstoppable. When they no longer seek approval from the so-called moral authorities of the world, they reclaim their power. This should terrify every leader who governs by fear rather than by truth, because once people taste the strength of their own resolve, they don't go back. They don't return to the shadows, and they certainly don't bow to nations who once defined them by their pain. The lesson: you don't need to be a superpower to stand tall. You don't need the world's backing to claim your dignity. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to say enough, to draw the line, not in the sand, but in the soul. Because resolve isn't forged in victory, it's forged in refusal, the refusal to be erased, the refusal to be silenced, the refusal to stay down when the world expects you to crawl. That's what we saw that night, a refusal to surrender. And in that refusal, a message was sent, ***, our existence is not yours to permit, it is ours to protect. ***, and no nation, no military, no narrative can erase that. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When was the last time you questioned the narrative you were fed? When was the last time you looked past the headline and asked yourself, is this the truth, or is it just convenient? Because what we witnessed the night Iran retaliated wasn't just a military event. It was a complete breakdown of the illusion of moral superiority. And the ones who were supposed to hold truth to power, they blinked. The media, for all its power and reach, has become less about information and more about performance. There's a storyline to protect, a character to villainize, and a hero to script. And God forbid that narrative gets challenged by reality. So when Iran stood up, not as the rogue villain of the century, but as a nation asserting its red line, the global media scrambled. They softened the blow, redirected attention, twisted the facts. Because the idea that the so-called aggressor could act with strategic precision and with a clear message doesn't fit the usual template. And let's not pretend this is new. The playbook is older than most of the leaders parroting it. First, you frame a country as irrational. Then you isolate them, and when they finally act in self-defense, you condemn them as the problem. It's propaganda polished to perfection. The only problem is, that night, too many people saw through it. You see, the problem with building your reputation on moral superiority is that eventually you have to live up to it. And when you don't, when the double standards become too obvious, when your outrage is selective, when your empathy has borders, people start asking questions. And once people start questioning the media, the government, the motives, that's when the real power begins to shift. Because the truth, whether the media likes it or not, doesn't need their approval. It doesn't need editing. It doesn't need to be palatable. It simply is. And that night, for a rare moment, truth cracked through the carefully constructed facade of Western diplomacy and media spin. This isn't about glorifying any nation. It's about calling out the blatant manipulation of narratives designed to keep certain players always in the right and others always in the wrong. It's about how quickly the story changes when the oppressed push back. 1 minute, you're told they're incapable, irrational, broken. The next, they've launched a military operation that leaves the world speechless, and the spin machine goes into overdrive. But the damage is done, because millions watched and millions felt something shift. The mask slipped. The myth wobbled. And beneath it, people saw the inconvenient truth that those who preach democracy and fairness often operate on a script that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with control. That night didn't just expose military vulnerabilities, it exposed narrative fragility. And now that the cracks are visible, no amount of PR can make people unsee what they saw. The truth is out, and it's no longer waiting for permission to be heard. There's a moment in every conflict, in every crisis, when time seems to freeze, not because of shock or fear, but because something undeniable has happened. Something irreversible, and that night when Iran struck with precision, what broke wasn't just a defense system. What shattered was a sense of immunity, the myth that some nations can act without ever having to answer for it. That myth died in real time, under the watchful eye of a world that could no longer pretend. Let's cut through the noise. This wasn't about escalation. This wasn't about revenge. This was about *** balance being forcibly restored. *** for far too long, Israel acted with a certainty that it would never truly be challenged. That its alliances, its influence, and its iron dome of impunity would protect it from ever having to face the kind of consequence it so often delivered to others. That night proved otherwise. That night proved *** consequence doesn't knock, it arrives. *** this is the uncomfortable part of history that no one wants to admit. *** eventually, even giants get humbled. *** not by size. Not by military budgets, but by truth, by resistance, by the inescapable law of cause and effect. You can't operate in a bubble forever. Eventually, the world outside punches through, and it doesn't ask politely. That strike didn't just dent a building, it dented certainty. It forced a reckoning, and what made it more powerful than any warhead was the psychological rupture it caused. Israel had built itself up as the region's unshakable force, its military unmatched, its defenses impenetrable, its deterrence unquestioned. But when those missiles rained down, what was revealed wasn't just vulnerability. It was the ** illusion of untouchability unraveling. ***, and here's the critical point, this wasn't chaos. This wasn't some rogue action by an unstable actor. It was calculated, controlled, measured. It wasn't meant to destroy a nation. It was meant to send a message, * you are not above consequence. *, and that message echoed not just through the Middle East, but through every capital that had grown comfortable with imbalance, with silence, with selective justice, because when balance is lost, conflict becomes inevitable, and when balance is reclaimed, even for a moment, the world has to pause and reassess its assumptions. That's what we saw. The pendulum didn't just swing, it cracked the foundation. But here's what matters most. Moments like this don't just change geopolitics. They change minds, they wake people up, they force a new conversation, and that, more than any military tactic, is the true shift we're witnessing. ***, a reawakening. ***, of nations, of people, of conscience. That night won't be remembered just for what was destroyed, it will be remembered for what was exposed. That power without restraint leads to collapse. That silence in the face of injustice always has an expiration date. And that no matter how long it takes, ** truth finds its way to the surface, and when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. It demands to be reckoned with. ***, let's get one thing straight, retaliation isn't just about bombs and blood. It's not about destruction for the sake of headlines. True retaliation, the kind that stings for decades, is built on something far more powerful than weaponry. It's built on ** dignity. ***, and when dignity rises from the ashes, it leaves a scar more lasting than any battlefield ever could. On that night, when Iran answered back, the world expected rage, it expected chaos, it expected recklessness. But what it didn't expect, and what caught everyone off guard, was the cold, calculated precision of it all. This wasn't the kind of retaliation born out of panic. This was personal, it was historic, and it came from a place far deeper than military strategy. It came from the gut of a nation that had been backed into a corner for far too long, a nation tired of being lectured, demonized, and dismissed, finally standing with its head held high. And what made it truly unsettling for the global elite was that it didn't come with theatrics. There was no desperate screaming into microphones, no emotional outbursts. Just action, controlled, deliberate, dignified. Because when a people have had everything stripped away, their narrative, their dignity, their right to exist, and they still find the strength to retaliate without losing their humanity, that's when the world starts to take notice. and not with applause, with fear. The irony is brutal. The more sophisticated the world claims to be, the more it underestimates the raw power of dignity. The West often associates power with polished speeches, with diplomatic games, with camera-ready condemnations. But on that night, Iran reminded everyone that power also looks like patience. It looks like restraint. And when that restraint finally snaps, it does so with terrifying clarity. The response wasn't about military victory. It was about narrative correction. For years, Iran had been painted as the villain, the aggressor, the unpredictable force. But retaliation that comes from dignity flips that script. It says, "We are not what you've made us out to be, and we will no longer sit silently while our people bleed and the world shrugs." And here's what truly rattled the world's conscience. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, the villain in the story isn't who we were told it was. That realization doesn't arrive with the crash of a missile. It arrives in the silence that follows when the dust settles, and all that remains is the uncomfortable truth that **, a dignified response, can sometimes feel more threatening than a brutal one **. Because dignity holds up a mirror, and when the aggressor sees their reflection in it, they don't see a hero. They see a bully, and no amount of firepower can fix that image. So remember, this dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't boast, but when it moves, it makes the whole world stop and pay attention. And on that night, it did just that. Not with noise, not with fury, but with a quiet, unshakable strength that said, "We're still here, and we will not bow."